American history. Christopher Columbus succeeded in sailing to America in 1492. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown, Virginia. This agreement is regarded as the country's first settlement. The British people continued to go to the United States after that. There were also French, Spanish, and Dutch settlers in several areas of the United States. During the 1770s, 2.5 million people lived in 13 British territories. These colonies saw rapid growth and development, as well as the creation of their own governmental and judicial institutions. Despite this, the Native Americans did not fare well throughout the expansion of the British colonies, since many of them perished from illnesses and lost their lands. Colonization. Major European nations spent some time exploring before the first colonies were founded in 1607. Europeans introduced maize, turkey, potatoes, beans, tobacco, and pumpkin to Europe, while also bringing horses, cattle, and pigs to the Americas. Many explorers died as a result of the sick climate, and early inhabitants contracted new ailments. For Native Americans, the effects of the new illnesses, particularly measles and smallpox, are far more severe. Many native people perished, generally before there were extensive European colonization. Spain, the Netherlands, and France were colonized. Through Christopher Columbus's second journey, which reached Puerto Rico on November 19, 1493, the Spanish explorers were the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent. The other Europeans reached Florida in 1513. The Appalachian Mountains. From 1534 through 1763, France colonized the region now known as New France. Outside of Quebec and Acadia, there weren't many permanent residents. Although the Wabanaki Confederation sided with New France in 4 French and Indian wars against British colonies allied with the Iroquois Confederation, the British expelled the Acadians from Acadia, Nova Scotia, and replaced them with New England peasants after New England defeated Acadia during the French and Indian Wars. Some Acadians eventually relocated to Louisiana, where they created the distinctive rural culture of the Cajuns, which endures today. They acquired American citizenship in 1803 as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. Upon the arrival of Americans after 1770, several French settlements along the Mississippi and Illinois rivers were taken. Scots-Irish, Germans, and Swedes settled other lands. Colonization by Britain. In the 17th century, the majority of British colonists, together with a small number of Dutch and Swedes, settled along the East Coast. Due to a severe labor shortage, slavery and other forms of forced labor were enforced in colonial America. Additionally, the British policy of friendly abandonment, disregard for salute, permitted the American spirit to grow independently of its European origins. Moreover, half of European immigrants were forced workers when they arrived in colonial America. In 1585, the British attempted to colonize Roanoke Island, but they were unsuccessful. Jamestown, Virginia, the earliest surviving British settlement, was built on the James River in 1607, marking the beginning of the American frontier. John Smith, John Rolfe, and other Englishmen seeking money and adventure created the colony. The colony nearly perished and went through decades of misery as a result of sickness and starvation, but it eventually prospered after a fresh generation of settlers came in the late 17th century, and built a commercial agribusiness based on tobacco. Around 50,000 prisoners were transferred by Britain to colonies in the Americas between the late 1610s and the American Revolution. The Powhatan Revolt in Virginia in 1622, which resulted in hundreds of British settlers being slain by Indians, was a serious war. The King Philip War in New England was the biggest struggle between Indian nations and English immigrants in the 17th century. There were also many losses in the Yamasee War in South Carolina. Although there was already a minor settlement in New England in 1620 by a group of Englishmen known as the Pilgrim Fathers, those who emigrated because of a disagreement with the Church. In the colony of Plymouth, Puritans established the Massachusetts Gulf Colony in 1630. Pilgrims and Puritans were more concerned with building what they dubbed the city on a hill, a better society, than they were with obtaining riches. On 1636, Roger Williams, who had been expelled from Massachusetts, founded a colony in Rhode Island. Was a very diverse region, making of the present states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The province of Carolina was the first effort to locate a British colony south of Virginia, while the Georgian colony, founded in 1733, was the last of the 13 colonies to remain standing. For the Native Americans, the growth of the colonies proved detrimental. Many of them perished from variola, a disease that Europeans introduced to America, and they lost their territories as a result. With a large number of Congressionists in New England, German and Dutch Reformation in the Central Colony, Catholicism in Maryland, and Irish-Scottish Presbyterian on the border. The colonies were known for their theological variety. There were many Anglican royal officials and businesspeople. The First Revival Movement, a religious movement headed by preachers like Jonathan Edwards, helped spread religion across society in the early 1700s. One of the first instances of a great movement, or anything involving many Americans, in American history was the Revival Movement. The condemnation of the witch Salem and the Revival Movement were responses to the circumstances in America at the time. This possibly affected the way that the American Revolution was thought about. The American evangelicals who were impacted by the Awakened placed a new emphasis on the supernatural outpouring of the Holy Spirit and a conversion that instilled a strong love for God in new followers. The Second Revival Movement, which started in the late 1790s, took the place of the revival because it packed that supremacy and moved newly developed evangelicalism into an early republic. There were 13 colonies in 1733. Typically, these colonies are divided into the central colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, the South, and New England, which relies primarily on small businesses, shipping, and other sectors. Cotton and tobacco plantations were located in the southern colony. These gardens were initially tended by laborers who were eager to work for a few years in exchange for land and access to America, and later by slaves. The middle colony is recognized for having a variety of cultures and religions and contains modest farms. The 13 colonies were entwined with the Atlantic economy, which involved the employment of ships for the slave trade as well as the transport of other items between the Americas, the West Indies, Europe, and Africa, such as fish, timber, spices, rum, sugar, gold, and manufactured goods. At that time, the principal cities and ports were New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. Britain and France fought a conflict known as the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 1763. The conflict was ultimately won by the British. Spanish gave Florida to the English, while France gave Louisiana to Spain and relinquished its territory in Canada to the British. This phrase represents the back end of colonial politics. English language learning in Canada and other countries substantially diminished. Francis Dan, the Native American tribe, the Albany Congress, and Benjamin Franklin's exhortation for all the colonies to unite or die were examples of how the war effort led to increased political unification among the colonies. King George III issued a royal proclamation in 1763 declaring that residents of the 13 colonies may not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains after Britain took control of French territory in North America. This declaration served to establish a new North American empire and safeguard the Indian population against European incursions towards the west. Later, the colonists and the kingdom experienced conflict. Without consulting the provincial assembly, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Law of 1765, imposing duties on the colonies. The Sugar Act, 1764, Stamp Act, 1765, Townshend Act, 1767, and Tea Act, 1768, all introduced new taxes, 1773. The colonists protested because they believed they had not attained their rights and were not represented in the British Parliament. They demanded a vote in the British Parliament by issuing a call to reject taxation without a representation of the people. Even as tensions grew in the late 1760s and early 1770s, they persisted in refusing to pay taxes. Activists in the city of Boston staged the Boston Tea Party in 1773 as a direct protest against the new tea tax. In protest to the Tea Act, colonists in Boston poured hundreds of cartons of tea from ships into Boston Harbor. A year later, Parliament reacted without delay. Boston was taken over by British forces, and they also passed the Coercion Act, which denied Massachusetts the right to vote of self-government and gave the region to the armed forces to control. In all colonies, this measure sparked resentment and opposition. The First Continental Congress was called by the 13 colonial leaders to plan their opposition against the Coercion Act. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, Roger Sherman, and John Jay were prominent members of the Congress. Congress produced a list of rights and grievances, called for a boycott of British goods, and paid the king to settle all of those issues. The Second Continental Congress was organized in 1775 to plan the defense of the colonies against the British forces after all of these efforts had little impact. American Revolution. Thomas Paine advocated for the colonies' independence from Britain in his 1776 treatise Common Sense. The 13 colonies approved the United States Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. The American Revolutionary War saw clashes between the colonies and Britain. Beginning at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the conflict. After American forces succeeded to take Saratoga in 1777, France agreed to join forces with the Americans. France joined forces with the Americans, bringing along Spain and the Netherlands, while the British battled on their own. Despite several setbacks, the American army led by George Washington was able to win the war thanks to the French's assistance in the triumph at Yorktown. Following the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Britain withdrew all of its forces from the United States. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776, and proclaimed the United States independence. This independence was founded on Republican ideals, which stressed popular sovereignty, required civic responsibility, rejected corruption, and condemned aristocracy. Seymour Martin Lipset, a political analyst, said that the United States was the first significant colony to effectively revolt against colonial control. The United States is the first new nation. Some historians contend that the American Revolution served as the fundamental inspiration for the nation's civic religion, which has influenced patriotism as well as the memories and meanings of the nation.